Un, 2, 3, test pour une télé.
Un de anglais, un de anglais, je passe au français.
Un, 2, 3, un, 2, 3.
Test.
مهم. 重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة. 为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для того, чтобы устный перевод был полным и качественным, необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Good morning, colleagues. I think we can start. Excellencies, distinguished participants, colleagues, distinguished representatives, I hereby declare open the 62nd regular session of the Human Rights Council. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome Mr. Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also Ms. Awa Dabo, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, to her first Human Rights Council as Deputy High Commissioner. It is also a special pleasure to welcome 8 delegates who are here thanks to the generous support of donors of the Voluntary Technical Assistance Trust Fund to support the participation of least developed countries and small island developing states in the work of the Council. The delegates are from Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Guinea, Guyana, Federated States of Micronesia, Rwanda, Samoa, and Senegal. We look forward to their active participation in the Council. Distinguished representatives, allow me to address a few organizational and procedural matters to begin with. During the organizational meeting on June 1st, we discussed the draft program of work for the 62nd session, which can be found on the Council website and the extranet. The program of work is a living document subject to changes. So I encourage everyone to regularly check the SCED website or application for the latest updates. Following the Council's adoption of extraordinary cost and time-saving measures on June 1st, the session is expected to close on Tuesday, July 7th. Let me thank you in advance for your cooperation in respecting the speaking time limit in order to complete our work on time. As reflected in the minutes of the Bureau meeting of 8 June, the Council will meet on Friday, 19th June from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. So that's 9 to 12 on Friday, and from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. in order to accommodate the informal high-level discussion on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Human Rights Council, which is scheduled to take place that day from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. The latest draft of the program of work dated 11th June reflects this adjustment of the Council's working hours on 19th June. I wish to highlight that the current draft program of work includes the presentation of the report of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. Allow me to recall that on 12th January this year, the Bureau took note of the Secretariat's explanation that the situation concerning the representation of Myanmar at the General Assembly had remained unchanged since 2021. And pending a change in the status quo in the Credentials Committee of the General Assembly on the representation of Myanmar, the Secretariat cannot process the registration of anyone as part of the delegation of Myanmar in the Council in 2026. Consequently, Myanmar is not represented in the Council in this session, the 62nd session. In this regard, and in line with the previous decisions of the Council since 2021, the Bureau agreed on June 8th to continue the past practice and propose to the Council that the presentation of the report of the High Commissioner mandated to take place during the 62nd session proceed as scheduled without the participation of the concerned country. Such a proposal is made on the basis that this exceptional circumstances does not set the precedent for the future. Are there any members of the Council wishing to comment on this proposal? I see no request for the floor. I take it that there is no objection, that the Council proceed with the presentation of the report of the High Council on the situation of human rights in Myanmar as scheduled without the participation of the country concerned. It is so decided. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, I now propose that the Council approve the draft program of work with the understanding that it is a living document. Does any member of the Council wish to comment on this proposal? I see none. The program of work for this session is approved. It is so decided. Excellencies, distinguished representative, the online system for the inscription of the lists of speakers for all interactive dialogue and panel discussion opened on Wednesday, June 10th, and closes 24 hours before the meeting in which the respective dialogue or discussion is scheduled to begin. Once the online inscription has closed, delegations may still inscribe or withdraw by sending email to the list of speakers desk. The list of speakers will close approximately 15 minutes after the beginning of each debate. With regard to the inscriptions on the list of speakers for interactive and enhanced interactive dialogues, except for the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on his annual report, delegations must indicate their preference in the online inscription system, as they do for panel discussions. I recall that this has been the practice since the Council's 59th session. Interested states are asked to rank dialogues in order of their priorities. Speaking slots are allocated by the system taking into account their priorities. If the number of states indicating the highest priority for a particular dialogue exceeds the maximum number of available speaking slots, the slots will be allocated on a first-come, first-served basis. The online system for inscription on the list of speakers for the adoptions of the UPR outcomes opened today, June 15 at 9 a.m. and close on Thursday, 18 June at 6 p.m. No inscriptions will be possible after this deadline. For national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, the list of speakers for all debates opened on Tuesday, 9 June at 2 p.m. I kindly request that all participants upload the Word version of their oral statements through the online system for the list of speakers. If this is not possible, please send them by email to the conference services and the Council Secretariat. Now, turning to draft proposals, allow me to recall that the deadline for the submissions of draft proposal for the 62nd session is Thursday, 25th June at 1 p.m. I encourage sponsors to table draft proposals as early as possible. The submission of a proposal after the deadline needs prior approval by the Council before it is registered by the Secretariat. Only under exceptional circumstances would an extension of the deadline for submission of draft proposals be approved by the Council and for a maximum of 24 hours. Let me also underline that in accordance with Resolution 5/1, delegations are invited to conduct open-ended informal consultations to secure the broadest possible support for their initiatives. At least one open-ended informal consultation should be held on each draft resolution and/or decision before it is considered for action by the Council. In the interest of ensuring the effective participation of all stakeholders in the work of the Human Rights Council, I encourage main sponsors of draft proposals to share draft text with civil society organizations and other observers that follow informal consultations. Excellencies, the effective conduct of the Council sessions as well as the fulfillment of its mandate rests upon a constructive, safe, and respectful environment. Disagreement with mandate holders and their reports can always be expressed. However, It is unacceptable for them to be insulted, personally attacked, threatened, or subjected to efforts aimed at undermining their independence and integrity when discharging their mandates. So that is unacceptable, and it should be unacceptable to all of us. Let me also reiterate my deep concern and regret at the personal attacks and unlawful unilateral sanctions directed against certain mandate holders of the Council. Such practices are incompatible with the spirit of cooperation and dialogue that must underpin our work. This is consistency between presidents of the Council. Now, turning to reprisals, the active participation of representatives of civil society and national human rights institutions is an essential component of the Human Rights Council. As president, I will follow up on all reported allegations of reprisals and intimidation committed against individuals or groups who have cooperated with the Council and its mechanisms. I call on all of us to take all necessary steps to prevent such acts from taking place in the first place and to ensure that they are promptly and seriously addressed in case that they do occur. Excellencies, colleagues, let me also emphasize that the United Nations, including this Council, has zero tolerance for any form of harassment, including sexual harassment. The UNOC Director General has pledged to implement the Code of Conduct to prevent harassment, including sexual harassment at UN system events. The Bureau encourages all delegations to be aware of and fully upholds a zero-tolerance policy and comply with the Code of Conduct. Delegations chairing informal consultations should consider reminding the participants in their meetings of the rules of participation to help prevent such incidents. I would encourage those who chair meetings, including informal discussions, to also share the code of conduct on this matter with their colleagues. Moreover, allow me to recall that Her Excellency, Ms. Caroline Ziadeh, is serving this council as the gender focal point, including for cases of sexual harassment at meetings and events of the Human Rights Council. I encourage everyone to refer to the webpage on the conduct of participants in the meetings and events of the Human Rights Council to learn more about preventing harassment and sexual harassment and how to report an incident when one does occur. You see on the screen the website about the conduct of participants. I encourage all delegation to refer to it. All complaints will be and would have to be dealt with promptly. Turning to the issue of accessibility, His Excellency Mr. Segap Kebekau Daka, Vice President of the Council, is the chair of the Task Force on Accessibility. There is also a focal point for accessibility within the Secretariat. Delegations are requested to upload their oral statements in Word format so that they are accessible to persons with disabilities. Speeches in PDF or other non-accessible formats will not be posted on the extranet. Let me also invite delegations to consider including language mandating accessibility in panel discussions when drafting relevant resolutions. This is the only way to ensure live captioning and sign language interpretation will be provided. So that is with the organizational matters. Excellencies, distinguished representative, I now declare open agenda item 2, entitled Annual Report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and Reports of the Office of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General. This agenda item will remain open throughout the session. I now have the pleasure of giving the floor to Mr. Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for the presentation of his annual report. You have that.
Terima kasih. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the struggle for human rights is a story of enormous progress followed by regression, of advances and losses, of steps forwards, backwards, and sideways. But the trajectory is clear. Ultimately, it's towards larger freedom. This global update is a snapshot of a complex mosaic that defies binary ideas of good or bad, allies or enemies. Clearly, we face very serious human rights challenges. An unprecedented, shameless onslaught against international law is causing appalling human suffering. We must call it out every time and everywhere and work to contain and end it. At the same time, the nuts and bolts of human rights work are delivering safety, dignity, and freedom for millions of people every day. Away from the headlines, human rights are improving lives, healing divisions, and creating opportunities. The Universal Declaration, the core treaties are ever more important. Little wonder then, when they are asked, huge majorities of people say they want more human rights, not less. I never forget the words of Nobel laureate Toni Morrison when she says, "The very serious function of racism is distraction." Let's not get distracted. Let's forge on with our work to promote and protect human rights and do everything possible to strengthen their foundations. Just one global agreement, the Convention Against Landmines, for example, helped reduce casualties from these heinous weapons by over 75% between 1999 and the early 2020s. Many perpetrators of atrocity crimes would never have been prosecuted without human rights work. Human rights need to be front and center of today's pressing issues, from the climate crisis to guidelines around artificial intelligence, from the Ebola outbreak to the Men's World Cup. And I encourage G7 leaders meeting across the lake to put human rights at the core of their discussions as a force for stability and progress. Mr. President, I welcome the announcement that the United States and Iran have agreed on a peace deal that provides for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and a framework for further negotiations. The conflict has had a devastating impact on human rights across the region and around the world. The last months have shown that the deep differences in the region cannot be resolved by military means. I deplore the use of force against Iran by Israel and the United States, which reportedly killed thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children, and destroyed hospitals, schools, homes, and other infrastructure. I again call for the findings of the US investigation into the horrific attack on Minab School to be made public. Iran's attacks on civilian infrastructure in Gulf countries and Jordan and its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz are completely unacceptable. The blockade has had dire consequences for the global economy, for the delivery of humanitarian aid, and for the most vulnerable, including some 20,000 seafarers. And the Deputy High Commissioner will brief you on this later today. I feel deeply for the people in Iran caught between war and cruel repression. Since killing thousands of people during the egregious crushing of protests in January this year, the authorities have intensified their brutal crackdown, arresting thousands and imposing even more severe restrictions on civic space. They have executed at least 40 people on national security grounds so far this year, including 18 protesters. Mr. President, at this fragile moment, it is clear all sides need to exercise maximum restraint and work to implement the agreement reached quickly and in good faith. In Gaza, Israeli forces have killed almost 1,000 Palestinians since the ceasefire was announced last October. The vast majority civilians. The Israeli authorities are pushing Palestinians into an ever-shrinking portion of the territory and imposing restrictions on life-saving aid. On the West Bank, Israeli security forces and settlers are accelerating the destruction of communities and the annexation of territory. So far this year, they have killed 57 people, injured nearly 1,300, detained hundreds, and issued 23 land confiscation orders. Meanwhile, since the ceasefire, we have recorded at least 82 reported killings of Palestinians by Hamas. Some senior Israeli officials have spoken publicly of the removal of all Palestinians from Gaza and of ending any possibility of a viable Palestinian state. All of this is totally illegal. We are out of red flags. Our many previous warnings have not been heeded. All those with influence must exert pressure to make the ceasefire a reality, to end the unbearable suffering of Palestinians, and to hold those responsible to account. Mr. President, the renewed escalation between Hezbollah and Israel since 2nd of March has dragged the Lebanese people once again into a war that is not of their making. And I hope yesterday's announcement will also bring them much needed relief. I'm alarmed by widespread Israeli strikes on populated areas and essential infrastructure. Some 3,600 people are reported killed, including hundreds of women and children, and more than 11,000 injured. Together with large-scale displacement orders, these attacks have forced more than 1 million people from their homes. At the same time, Hezbollah is launching sophisticated, far-reaching attacks into Israel, causing civilian deaths and injuries. 26 civilians have reportedly been killed across Israel since late February in the hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Iran. I call for an immediate end to hostilities, the withdrawal of Israel from Lebanese territory, and investigations into violations by all parties of international humanitarian and human rights law. We are deploying our own independent and impartial assessment mission to Lebanon in agreement with the government. Mr. President, in Sudan, the horrific conflict has expanded and escalated, marked by a sharp increase in the use of drone warfare. Between January and May 26, our office documented more than 1,000 civilians killed by drone strikes. Rape and sexual violence are rampant. In Ukraine, it is deeply concerning that the horrendous war has escalated sharply in recent months. My team verified that more than 7,000 civilians were killed or injured in the first 5 months of 2026, more than during the same period in any of the previous 3 years. The human rights and security situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo remains highly volatile. Clashes between the Congolese armed forces and armed groups in North and South Kivu are complicating the response to the deadly Ebola virus, and we will provide more details to the Council on these 3 situations. Mr. President, I'm appalled by the reckless, wanton approach to human life that characterizes some of today's global decision-making. We are seeing a global shift in how war is waged. In Sudan, long-range drones have destroyed aid convoys, and I saw myself vital energy infrastructure. In Ukraine, relentless drone attacks have caused mass casualties and terrorized civilians. In the DRC, Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, and Myanmar, drone warfare is creating a new circle of hell. The UN has warned for many years against the development of lethal autonomous weapons. This reality is now upon us. States urgently need to consider the moral and legal questions this raises, agree on a common approach that protects civilian lives, and recommit to diplomacy and mediation. They must update legal frameworks to require human control and ensure accountability. Autonomous weapons cannot become a license for atrocity crimes. The prospect of billion-dollar AI-enabled weapons brought down by billion-dollar AI-enabled defensive shields exposes the horror, emptiness, and futility of war. Security experts warn that unrestrained military operations that flatten entire areas are fueling grievances and contributing to a new generation of extremists. They can never lead to lasting security. We need a much stronger focus on the financial drivers of this nihilism. Who benefits? We need to replace war economies with human rights economies. Mr. President, partout dans le monde,
people around the world are crying out for action anchored in human rights to de-escalate tensions and prevent conflict. The Central Sahel is at a dangerous tipping point. In Mali, extremist armed groups launched coordinated attacks on several cities and towns in April, causing mass civilian casualties. I am concerned about reports that security forces carried out extrajudicial killings, abducted political opponents, and detained prominent journalists for doing their jobs. In Burkina Faso, extremist armed groups continue to attack, kidnap, and threaten civilians. I deplore that the authorities have dissolved or suspended more than 930 civil society organizations since April. Attacks by extremist armed groups in Niger are growing, and the formation of so-called self-defense groups raises serious risks of abuses and intercommunal violence. No one has been held accountable for violations reportedly committed by the military. In Cameroon, the security situation in the northwest and southwest regions remains deeply concerning as security forces and armed separatist groups are implicated in unlawful killings and kidnappings. At least 20 people were reportedly killed in April 2026 alone.
I urge the authorities to conduct a prompt and independent investigation into airstrikes by the military that reportedly killed more than 100 civilians in the north in May. I'm also deeply concerned by repeated abductions of school children and teachers. In Ethiopia, the armed conflict in Amhara and Oromia continues unabated as the warring parties kill, abduct, rape, arrest, and detain civilians. I continue to be worried about the situation in Tigray. Reports of violence involving Orthodox Christians and Muslims in Oromia reflect a concerning escalation of intercommunal tensions. Somalia faces heightened insecurity and humanitarian needs. Proposed electoral reforms have triggered an uptick in tensions and violence. My new office agreed recently will work to support the Somali people. In Haiti, gang violence has resulted in at least 2,300 deaths, 1,100 injuries, and 99 kidnappings since the start of the year. I urge the authorities to move quickly on the judicial units to tackle impunity. The gang suppression force is urgently needed, and it needs to operate in line with international human rights law. Hay una emergencia.
Cuba is in the throes of a human rights emergency. It is suffocating under US sanctions. The alarm is flashing red. We need urgent de-escalation. In Peru, the next government will need to prioritize the restoration of the rule of law, the independence of judicial institutions, and a national dialogue to heal a deeply divided society.
In Syria, thousands of victims and survivors demand justice and accountability. The prosecution of the former president and other officials, while at this point mostly in absentia, is an important step. These proceedings need to respect international standards and more must follow. My office is working to support transitional justice and promote reconciliation. The Syrian people need to be able to build their own future without outside interference. In Yemen, I call again for the immediate and unconditional release by the de facto Houthi authorities of personnel from the United Nations, civil society organizations, and diplomatic missions, including 8 of my own staff. These detentions are utterly unacceptable. Mr. President, cuts to aid around the world are having a catastrophic impact on human rights. Total humanitarian needs for this year are equivalent to just 3 days of global military spending. The funding needed by my office across this entire year is less than what the world spends on weapons and soldiers in 2 hours. Unless we change course, poverty and hunger will spike. Tensions will escalate and more people will be forced from their homes along unsafe migration routes. And this affects everyone and no country is immune. Instability, inequalities, and weak governance are fertile ground for extremism and conflict. They also fuel transnational crime, including the trade in illicit drugs worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Criminal groups are exploiting global crisis, conflict, and migration to expand their activities from Afghanistan to Guinea-Bissau to the Sahel and the Americas. Violence associated with drug trafficking has risen sharply in many countries along trafficking routes. Meanwhile, the so-called war on drugs has become a vicious circle. Militarized responses, particularly in the Americas, feed further violence. The United States of America has reportedly killed more than 200 people in airstrikes against civilian ships in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Calling these attacks part of a war on narco-terrorism does not justify them. Illicit drugs are also having a massive negative impact on our climate and environment, from water stress to deforestation and the dumping of toxic waste. Governments need to tackle corruption, strengthen institutions, and invest in harm reduction, education, healthcare, and jobs. Mr. President, in my last global update, I spoke of the authoritarian playbook. It's growing thicker by the day. Our preliminary data indicates that some 950 human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists were killed or forcibly disappeared worldwide in 2025, more than double the number a decade ago. In Uganda, for example, the new Protection of Sovereignty Act strengthens state control over civil society organizations. In Belarus, Iran, and Russia, thousands of human rights activists and journalists are criminalized and prosecuted as terrorists and extremists. In Serbia, the demands of anti-corruption protests remain unanswered for many months, while the human rights situation is deteriorating. In India, following welcome court decisions to grant bail to human rights defenders who have been in lengthy pre-trial detention, I urge their immediate release. Attacks against the environmental human rights defenders are rising. Our latest figures show they are detained in at least 55 countries. Media censorship is growing, while freedom of expression declining in 44 countries, according to several surveys. Globally, my office has recorded more than 800 journalists and media workers behind bars, including citizen journalists and human rights bloggers. Most recently, journalists have been prosecuted under vague charges in Tunisia and Turkey. And in Gabon, Iran, the Republic of the Congo, and Russia, authorities curtailed access to information through internet shutdowns. In Zambia forced the cancellation of RightsCon, the world's largest digital tech and human rights conference. Around the world, particularly in Southeast and East Asia and parts of Africa, Central Asia, Europe, and Central America, transnational repression is increasingly used as a tool of persecution across borders to pursue government critics and human rights defenders. A number of governments are even misusing Interpol processes for this purpose. We need to put a much stronger focus on this. Mr. President, history shows that authoritarians have often succeeded in confining millions of people within a parallel reality of conspiracies and lies. Today's extreme concentration of political, economic, and technological power is facilitating this. When we consider the staggering sums spent by tech tycoons on lobbying, it is clear that today's innovation often serves private interests rather than the public good. Meanwhile, we are offered new products, such as AI classes, that establish ever more sophisticated shields between people and reality. I wish someone would invent classes that help us see the humanity in each other instead. Some tech companies and countries, particularly in the European Union, are considering age-related restrictions on social media as part of their efforts to protect children online. My office's new guidelines on AI and children's rights can help to ensure that these measures are grounded in human rights. The organized backlash against gender equality forms one of the thickest chapters of the authoritarian playbook. Violence against women is treated as a sad but acceptable fact against a backdrop of misogynistic rhetoric and aggressive online content. The so-called manosphere monetizes harmful stereotypes that undermine the rights of both young men and women. Recent surveys show that Gen Z men in many countries are more opposed to women's independence than their grandfathers. Afghanistan's new law implying the legitimization of child marriage aggravates the agony of Afghan women and girls. It is despicable and must be abolished, together with all other serious discriminatory measures. Russia is intensifying its persecution of LGBTIQ+ communities. In the past 3 months alone, at least 9 organizations protecting their rights have been designated extremist. I deplore the Ghanaian parliament's decision to pass a bill with harsher criminal sanctions against LGBTQ+ people and human rights defenders, and I urge the President not to sign the law. I also deplore the adoption of legal provisions in Niger that criminalize consensual same-sex relationships with severe sanctions. 6 years after the death of George Floyd, the knee is still on the necks of many Black people around the world. White nationalist groups complain about supposed double standards and two-tier policing. But the facts show that across regions, police are several times more likely to use force against people of African descent. The dehumanization of migrants and refugees, including in the UK, US, and many EU countries, is appalling, often leading also to the denial of their rights. The European Union's new rules on returning migrants risk expanding the use of detention, establishing offshore return hubs, and weakening safeguards against refoulement. I'm also worried about growing pressure from some states on the European Court of Human Rights around migration and refugee law. I'm particularly concerned about the continuing trend of involuntary returns of Afghan asylum seekers and refugees from countries, including Iran and Pakistan, to Afghanistan in breach of international refugee law. In South Africa, poverty and inequalities are driving social tensions, including xenophobia and violence against migrants and refugees. I trust the government will make good on its pledge to put human rights at the heart of its response. Mega sports events are supposed to bring people together in unity and peace. It is troubling to see how immigration enforcement is impacting the Men's World Cup. My plea to the US authorities is that they provide safety and dignity to all players, officials, and supporters. And I urge all governments to address refugee and migration issues humanely and in full compliance with the tried and tested rules of international rights and refugee law. Mr. President, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, as well as attacks and discrimination against indigenous peoples and ethnic and religious minorities are widespread and in many cases rising. We need an all-out effort to curb this phenomenon. I'm very concerned about China's counterterrorism and assimilation policies, particularly as they affect minorities in the Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Tibetan regions. The new law on ethnic unity risks deepening restrictions on freedoms of language, education, practice of religion, culture, expression, and assembly, and penalizing the peaceful exercise of minority rights in general. I call for the law to be repealed and for these practices to end. Nicaragua stands alone in not engaging with the human rights system at all. The recent death in custody of indigenous leader Brooklyn Rivera is the latest of its repressive policies and broader patterns of violations against indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. Mr. President, the social and economic costs of the crisis I've mentioned ripple across generations and the wider world. Young voters in many countries feel alienated and ignored. They demand their human rights as a ladder to better life. Last month, in the Republic of Korea, I saw how Gwangju and other human rights cities are improving people's lives with equitable policies on transport, healthcare, education, and more. During my recent visit to Mongolia, I was encouraged that the authorities are using the recommendations of human rights bodies to advance reform. Comprehensive anti-discrimination laws strengthen social cohesion and build trust within communities. My office is supporting countries with such legislation. I welcome recent legal successes. In Australia, for example, an indigenous group secured record compensation for mining without their consent. In China, the Supreme Court recognized that discrimination and bullying against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people violate their human rights. And I trust that the appointment of the new Attorney General in Guatemala will strengthen democracy in practice. Across all regions, from Benin to Montenegro, from the Philippines to Slovakia and Spain, national human rights institutions are supporting victims of violations, safeguarding civic space, and combating online hate speech. Regional mechanisms also play an important role. Regional courts in Latin America, Africa, and Europe are holding states to account for environmental harms from Nigeria and Peru to Switzerland and beyond. The African Union Compliance Framework for Peace Operations has helped build a culture of accountability. Despite significant challenges, the Association of Southeast Asian States, ASEAN, can play a crucial mediating role to resolve the conflict in Myanmar. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has proven to be a successful path towards justice for victims, from arbitrary detention to privacy rights and more. The international human rights system has also proven its value. The work of my own staff sheds light in the darkest corners. It has been cited in high-profile legal cases, including by the International Court of Justice, and has influenced hundreds of legal reforms. Investigations mandated by this Council have helped bring perpetrators of international crimes to justice. It's a significant achievement as the Council marks its 20th anniversary. For example, the Commission of Inquiry on Syria has cooperated directly with over 63 criminal investigations into war crimes and crimes against humanity committed since 2011. Human rights shape judicial thinking at national and regional levels. The Swiss Supreme Court has referred to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in more than 300 of its decisions. Treaty bodies have advanced legal and policy reform through their recommendations, including on abolishing the death penalty and on women's sexual and reproductive health rights. I condemn disinformation campaigns and attempts to undermine the credibility of the UN human rights system, including special procedure mandate holders. Criticism and debate are legitimate and necessary. Efforts to intimidate, to discredit, or even sanction are not. They are unacceptable. Mr. President, human rights work is always unfinished business. We can never take anything for granted. And those on the front lines know that. I think of the human rights defenders that I met recently in Sudan, in Mongolia, in Mexico, and in many other countries, all struggling in different ways, all showing courage and tenacity every day. We know how much human rights can unite us, which is why we launched the Global Alliance for Human Rights last week. Over the next 2 years, this alliance will become a hive of activity with different groups and communities around the world making new connections and building new partnerships. Human rights are the glue that binds us together, and when we join forces to strengthen those bonds, we do build a better world for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Let me remind all delegates that the interactive dialogue on the High Commissioner's annual report is scheduled to begin tomorrow morning. And now let's take a short technical break.
let's see what happens.
Yeah. Colleagues, I think we can continue with our discussion. I'll wait a few moments as colleagues settle down. I've done that. Excellencies, distinguished participants, pursuant to Council Resolution 61/1, we will now hear the High Commissioner's oral update on the human rights consequences resulting from the unprovoked attack by the Islamic Republic of Iran against Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan. And I now have the pleasure of giving the floor to Ms. Awa Dabo, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, to present the oral update. Madam, you have the floor.
Mr. President, the High Commissioner addressed the broader human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran and the US-Israeli attacks in his global update earlier today, and called for the agreement reached to be implemented quickly and in good faith, as requested in Human Rights Council Resolution 61/1. This briefing will focus on missile and drone attacks launched by Iran against the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, and Jordan since 28 February. These attacks contributed to widening and expanding the conflict. The information and conclusion in this update are preliminary. A comprehensive assessment would require additional investigation and verification, including visits to the countries affected. Governments in the region report that Iran's attack killed 19 civilians, injured 850, and damaged critical civilian infrastructure, including airports, energy facilities, desalination plants, ports, residential areas, schools and universities, places of worship, and diplomatic premises. Attacks targeting civilians and civil infrastructure are a serious breach of international humanitarian law. Attacks against water desalination and electricity facilities caused direct material damage that affected the continuity of water supplies. Attacks on ports and airports disrupted access to food, medicine, and essential goods, and restricted the freedom of movement of civilians within and beyond the affected states. Strikes on energy infrastructure created toxic fires and compounded environmental risks. A drone attack on Baraka nuclear plant in the UAE caused a fire in an electrical generator, raising serious concerns around nuclear safety and security. The geography of the Gulf means that disruption to its narrow maritime choke points or highly concentrated aviation networks immediately causes a broader crisis, affecting people across the region and beyond. The imposition by the Islamic Republic of Iran of a blockade on routine maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is completely unacceptable. Combined with the imposition of a naval blockade by the United States on ships traveling to and from Iranian ports, it has caused significant disruption to global energy supplies and restricted the movement of goods including humanitarian aid. Fertilizer shortages during the planting season could affect harvests across South Asia. Economists warn that unless the strait is opened, some of the world's most vulnerable economies could be thrown into chaos, increasing poverty and hunger for millions. The indirect effects of the attacks reportedly ranged from declining investor confidence to the increased cost of insurance, the cancellation of bookings, the postponement of projects, the disruption of supply chains, and the suspension of communications and cloud computing services. Mr. President, many of the strikes in this conflict raise serious concerns under international law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and the prohibition of attacks aimed at spreading terror among the civilian population. The priority must be an end to all armed attacks, a commitment to protect civilians and their infrastructure, and strenuous efforts to move forward from the current ceasefire to a comprehensive and sustainable peace agreement. It is essential that all those involved in the blockade of maritime traffic restore the free flow of goods and energy supplies through the Strait of Hormuz immediately to prevent a global energy and food security catastrophe. Until that time, we urge states to support the UN initiative to establish a humanitarian corridor to allow the unimpeded passage of food, medicines, fertilizers, and essential goods through the strait. At a bare minimum, specialized agencies, including WFP and FAO, must have the resources needed to prevent the projected global food security crisis. We also encourage states to provide targeted support to the developing countries that are most exposed to food insecurity and economic shocks from this conflict. It is essential that Iran ceases attacks on its Gulf neighbors and Jordan, and that all states involved in de-escalate the situation immediately with a focus on civilians and on human rights of people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. In accordance with our practice, I will now give the floor to the delegations of the countries concerned. Before doing that, may I request all delegations to deal with human rights issues with dignity and respect, and to adhere to the well-established principles of the United Nations. I call upon all speakers to uphold UN standards when referring to countries. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain, who has a total of 5 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. I'm taking the floor on behalf of Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Sultanate of Oman, and Jordan, as well as the United Arab, the UAE and Kuwait will take the floor later in their national capacity. We have taken good note of the oral update provided by the High Commissioner pursuant to Resolution 61/1 relating to the human rights repercussions following the unprovoked attacks by Iran against our states. We have listened to this update, which mentioned the consequences on vital infrastructure and other targets. There has been targeting of civilians. There's been the violation of the rights of millions of inhabitants of our region, and this goes over and beyond the borders of the countries targeted. There are very many people that count on the continuity of vital services. Energy power plants have been severely affected, and this demonstrates that the repercussions go over and beyond the states targeted. They, in fact, weaken regional stability and threaten the very security of persons. The right to development, to health are jeopardized. Our countries reiterate our condemnation of these attacks. This is a violation of our sovereignty and of our territorial integrity. And all of this contravenes the UN Charter and the rules of good neighborliness. Iran is responsible for these attacks, and there have been direct and indirect effects on civilians, on their well-being, and on the enjoyment of their rights. There have been severe consequences on the security and stability of the entire region. Our countries are firmly attached to peace, to the sovereignty of states, and to good neighborly relations. We also believe in dialogue in order to settle conflicts. Establishing trust between states is not something that is done through violence and force. It requires respect for international law and the respect of mutual interests. President, to protect civilians and guarantee continuity of services are a must for all countries, particularly when we face threats to our stability and security. It is important to mention measures which are taken pursuant to domestic and international law, including the UN Charter, in order to protect our citizens and all residents of our countries while preserving our security and stability. The stability of the region and stability for our people are goals that require collective efforts, and dialogue is available for those who wish to promote peace and security, and those who wish to promote good relations based on peace and good neighborliness. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, today marks the first anniversary of the aggression of the US and Israel regime against the Islamic Republic of Iran in June 2025. We pay solemn tribute to thousands innocent victims of the 12-day war and 40 days war against Iran. We also honor those victims and survivors of these invasions, whose suffering was met with the silence of many countries and whose calls for justice were unheard. Since June 2025, the people of Iran have lived either under the direct assault of unprecedented military attacks or under the constant shadow of threats of further aggression and longer blockade. Yet, those who so often claim the mantle of human rights advocacy have remained conspicuously silent. This sense of injustice was compounded when the Human Rights Council chose to adopt Resolution 61/1 against a country that itself is the victim of aggression. The very presentation of today's oral update pursuant to that resolution illustrates a troubling inversion of roles, whereby the distinction between victim and aggressor has become blurred. In our view, this development raises serious questions about the consistency, impartiality, and credibility of the international human rights system, particularly when those who have endured the consequences of conflict find themselves placed in the dock while the origins of that conflict remains insufficiently scrutinized. Today, after 1 year of remarkable resistance, I want to glorify the resilience of the great Iranians. They are a people who refuse to barter their dignity, independence, convictions, and right to self-determination. Mr. President, in a moment when our territory was under grave threat of invasion, our officials, including our supreme leader, were assassinated. Our people were under indiscriminate aerial bombardments. Our children in schools like Minab faced the terror of precision and targeted strikes. And in a time that our innocent women and girls, like those in Lamerd, were torn apart by testing PRMS missiles, what course of action could reasonably be expected of us, other than the exercise of our inherent right to self-defense in accordance with international law? We were not subjected to attacks originating from distinct continents, but from territories in our immediate vicinity. Our response was therefore directed at the sources of the imminent threat in exercise of inherent right of self-defense as recognized under international law. Our actions were aimed at neutralizing an ongoing and imminent danger with the sole objective of protecting our territorial integrity and civilian population. Mr. President, the Persian Gulf is a strategic space whose security is indivisible. Like a single vessel at the sea, a breach in one part ultimately imperils the integrity of the whole. The security of our region must be built by the countries of the region themselves, through cooperation and mutual respect, rather than through the intervention and influence of external powers. If Iran ultimately accepted the ceasefire, despite its imperfections and subsequent challenges, it did so out of a profound sense of responsibility toward regional peace and collective security. Mr. President, we finally brought the war to an end so that we would never again have to hear the roar of advanced and indiscriminate weapons over schools and students. And so that mothers like Makan Nasiri's mother, who months after the attack on the Minab school still has not found any trace of her child, would no longer be left waiting for the discovery of even fragments of their children's remains. But the end of war must mark the beginning of accountability and the provision of effective remedies, reparation, and redress. This requires meaningful efforts to acknowledge harm, provide adequate compensation, support rehabilitation, and restore the dignity of victims and their families. Such measures are indispensable not only for addressing the consequences of past violations, but also for ensuring their non-repetition. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. May I once again request all delegations to deal with human rights issues with dignity and respect and to adhere to the well-established principles of the United Nations. And I call upon all speakers to uphold UN standards when referring to countries and to refrain from using words like regime. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait. You have 5 minutes.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation associates itself with the statement of the GCC and Jordan. We express our appreciation as well for the oral update by the Deputy High Commissioner of Human Rights in implementation of Human Rights Resolution 61/1 on the disconcerting situation of human rights resulting from the attacks against my country, Kuwait, as well as the GCC countries. In addition to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, Mr. President, the oral update by the High Commissioner is an objective representation of the grave situation of human rights resulting from the systematic attacks against civilians, civilian infrastructure, and vital infrastructure in the Kuwait and other countries in the region. This led to catastrophic losses amongst people and disabilities amongst the innocent civilians, in addition to the substantial material losses which affect negatively the life of safe residents and nationals, which undermines the right of persons to live in a safe and secure environment. Once again, we condemn in the gravest terms these systematic and recurrent attacks, including a recent attack by 24 drones against our country, totaling, and that is since the 29th of February, totaling 893 drones, in addition to 379 ballistic missiles, in addition to 15 cruise missiles. These systematic attacks do not run counter to the principles of good neighborliness only, but it also contravene the principles of the international human rights law and the international humanitarian law, as well as the United Nations Charter. It also undermines the global and regional efforts to de-escalate and build trust in the region. Out of this context, we have been closely monitoring the recent arrangements and understandings between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. The state of Kuwait welcomes this agreement, and we hope that this initial step will be a linchpin to strengthen a comprehensive regional peace that will translate practically into committing Iran to stop aggression against its neighbors and stop all attacks that destabilize the region. We also emphasize that these negotiations must continue to realize real, sustainable, regional and international peace and ensure the interests of the countries of the region. Mr. President, the security and safety of our region is closely linked to the safety and security of vital marine corridors, particularly the Strait of Hormuz. Strait of Hormuz is a strategic corridor that serves the economy of the world at large. As such, we forewarn that any compromise of the security of this strait, as per the United Nations UNCLOS, will be catastrophic. The catastrophic consequences will not stop at the borders of the region. It will also undermine the supply chains of the world and the world economy. This requires a strict global stand to stop these wanton practices. As such, we reaffirm Kuwait's right, comprehensive and principled right to self-defense and to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity according to Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Iran must also be held responsible for these attacks, and along with the legal consequences of these attacks pursuant to Human Rights Resolution L38. The welfare of the region is predicated on strengthening diplomatic ties and constructive dialogue and peaceful means, while respecting the sovereignty of the states and non-interference in their internal affairs. This will ensure peace, welfare, and flourishing for the countries of the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates, the last concerned country on my list. You have 5 minutes, sir.
السيد الرئيس.
Mr. President, we associate with the statement of the GCC plus Jordan. Since the convening of the past session and the unanimous decision of the HRC rejecting the unprovoked attacks by Iran on countries that are not party to the ongoing conflict, Iran has continued its flagrant contravening to international law and international legitimacy and preventing a world that is based on peaceful relations. In flagrant breach to international law, there is no rational explanation in any form or shape as to the unprovoked and flagrant attacks by Iran on its neighborhood. There's no law that can consider this legitimate. The UAE reserves its intrinsic and legitimate right to self-defense in line with international law and Article 51 of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Iran has disrupted the maritime access in the Strait of Hormuz, preventing tankers and ships from passing, undermining international trade. And the ongoing negotiations might carry the promise of putting an end to these hostile actions, and we insist on the importance of applying and adhering to all the items of any agreement. Since 28th of February, the UAE has been subjected to over 3,000 ballistic missile and cruise missile and drone attacks. And those assaults were not just an attack on our sovereignty, but also an attack on human rights, including the right to life, security, healthcare, education, and work. This had a direct impact in the UAE with the death of civilians from various nationalities, including women and children. This is in addition to the destruction and damage to civilian objects and infrastructure and government, industrial, and tourism infrastructure, including oil and gas and energy facilities, as well as the targeting of the Zayed International Airport and Fujairah Airport, and also schools and universities and places of worship and telecommunications infrastructure. All of them were targeted. Mr. President, the UAE model did not start yesterday. Ever since we started building bonds with
تعايش وبناء جسور مقدمة للعالم رسالة راسخة
This meant that innovation and collaboration are part and parcel of international cooperation towards prosperity and development. And in response to this unprovoked and unprecedented assault, we have shown our ability to defend our airspace and our nation. And this has seen appreciation in the international sphere. We have shown resilience with our various critical sectors, including energy, aviation, and ports. They all continued to work without interruption, preserving our position as a trusted hub. Our services have continued to be delivered to our citizens, residents, and visitors without discrimination. This reflects the social cohesion in the UAE and its ability to stand the test. We have dedicated efforts to preserving our critical infrastructure, the continuation of business, and preserving the capabilities of the state as we continue to ensure that our model is based on prosperity, stability, and development in all circumstances. Thank you, President.
Thank you. This brings us to the end of this presentation. I wish to thank the Deputy High Commissioner for her participation. We will now take a short break before holding the enhanced interactive dialogue on the oral update by the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for the Sudan. Excellencies, distinguished representative colleagues, we will now begin the enhanced interactive dialogue on the oral update by the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for the Sudan, pursuant to Council Resolution 60/3. It is my honor to welcome once again Ms. Awa Dabo, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, who will deliver the opening statement. It is also my honor to welcome our distinguished participants. The distinguished members of the Fact-Finding Mission for the Sudan are Mr. Mohamed Chande Othman, Ms. Joy Ngozi Ezelo, and Ms. Mona Rishmawi. I also welcome Mr. Mohamed Ahmed, representative of Christian Solidarity Worldwide, a civil society organization. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. And I now have the honor to give the floor to the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights for her statement. Madam.
Mr. President, distinguished participants, global attention is being pulled in many directions by escalating crises. We must be clear, Sudan cannot be forgotten. The conflict has deepened and expanded, marked by a sharp increase in the use of armed drones by the warring parties. Civilians are enduring devastating new levels of suffering. Between January and May 2026, our office documented more than 1,000 civilians killed by drone strikes. These account for some 80% of all conflict-related civilian deaths recorded by our office this year. Both the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces have launched drone attacks across the country repeatedly, hitting civilian infrastructure, including in areas where there had not been active hostilities. In the first 5 months of this year, our office documented at least 16 drone strikes on health facilities and 33 on markets. In one of the deadliest attacks, a strike on Ed Dayin Teaching Hospital in East Darfur in March killed more than 60 civilians. In January, a drone attack on a market in Dilling in South Kordofan killed at least 12 civilians. Attacks have taken place mainly in Kordofan and Darfur and are also spreading to Blue Nile, White Nile, and Khartoum. Patterns of repeated aerial strikes, including by drones, on markets, health facilities, and water and energy infrastructure, raise serious concerns under international humanitarian law and undermine the rights to health, food, and water. Drone warfare is terrifying for civilians who do not know whether the next strike will hit their neighborhoods, markets, health centers, or vehicles as they flee. As hostilities escalate in border areas, including North Darfur and Blue Nile states, the risk of regional spillover and destabilizing rises. Mr. President, sexual violence has reached unprecedented levels in scale and brutality, including gang rape, sexual torture, and sexual enslavement. Sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war to terrorize and to punish based on perceived affiliation and ethnic identity. We will issue a report in the coming days that documents and analyzes the systematic use of sexual violence in this conflict. Since the start of the war, our office documented more than 830 victims of sexual violence, mostly women and girls, but also men and boys, in 16 out of the 18 states of Sudan. This is just the tip of the iceberg, given what we know about the obstacles to reporting these attacks. Accountability for these horrific crimes is virtually absent. This impunity fuels repeated cycles of sexual violence and deepens trauma. It will scar communities and societies for generations. Grave human rights violations and abuses by all parties are compounding what is already the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Some 34 million people need aid. Since the start of the war, more than 14 million people have been displaced from their homes within and outside of Sudan. Fleeing violence by no means guarantees safety. It often adds another layer of risk. On their journeys, civilians face arbitrary detention, abduction for ransom, sexual and gender-based violence, and summary executions. Our office has also documented numerous drone strikes on vehicles transporting civilians. Survival for millions of Sudanese largely depends on the courage and solidarity of their communities and local humanitarian responders. Networks of volunteers are doing what they can to fill gaps, including distributing food through community kitchens and supporting displaced people and vulnerable families, often at great personal risk. These local humanitarian responders must be protected from attacks and arbitrary detention. Those who might provide scrutiny and promote accountability must also be protected. Our office has received credible reports that warring parties have abducted and threatened journalists, media workers, and other members of civil society. Hundreds of journalists have fled the country since the start of the war, which creates an information vacuum in which propaganda and conspiracy can thrive. Parties to the conflict are weaponizing information. Against this backdrop, the work of our office to document, verify, and bring to light violations and abuses, and to stand with civil society is crucial. Mr. President, this litany of violations and the rampant impunity are not random. This war is sustained by its own terrifying rationale. Domestic and foreign players are exploiting Sudan's vast natural resources, including gum, Arabic, and gold. Global exports of gum Arabic have long been an important source of income for Sudan's people, as this product is widely used in candy, medicine, and cosmetics. Today, the parties to the conflict are fighting for control of this resin as well as gold and livestock. They are enriching themselves and bankrolling war crimes at the expense of the Sudanese people. In parallel, foreign powers and suppliers are providing drones and other advanced weapons, which Sudan itself cannot manufacture, reaping gains of all sorts whilst further entrenching this senseless war. Mr. President, this war is already spilling over Sudan's borders. Any further escalation would be dangerous for the region and beyond. All attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop immediately. All countries need to ensure full compliance with the UN Security Council's arms embargo in Darfur. Across the entire territory of Sudan, all countries need to prevent the transfer of arms, including drones that are being used with manifest regard for the protection of civilians. Stronger diplomatic and political pressure is crucial to push parties towards a humanitarian truce that leads to a permanent ceasefire, followed by a transition to inclusive civilian rule. The High Commissioner has shared human rights-based confidence-building measures with the parties and those involved in mediation efforts. They reinforce protection and accountability as core components of any pathway to peace. The international community needs to do everything it can to break the cycle of impunity. This includes states supporting the work of the International Criminal Court with respect to crimes in Darfur and making full use of universal jurisdiction to ensure justice for victims. We also urge states to advocate for the Security Council to refer the situation in the whole of Sudan to the International Criminal Court. Governments must strengthen oversight and traceability of resources that are being used to fuel the conflict. Companies need to ensure their supply chains do not contribute to violations and abuses. Sudan is built on the diversity of its people. The leaders of the warring parties are cynically shredding the social fabric with consequences that will echo through generations. The international community needs to act urgently to protect the Sudanese people and to avert an even wider crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the fact-finding mission for their introductory remarks, and I give the floor to Mr. Mohamed Ahmed. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, now in its fourth year, the conflict of Sudan continues to be characterized.
Could the speaker kindly pull his microphone towards him a little for the interpreters? Thank you.
International crimes committed by the Sudan Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, and their allied forces. Today, the mission wishes to update the Council on its increasing concerns regarding the use of arbitrary detention, torture, and enforced disappearance by both parties as instruments of control over civilian populations. Civilians perceived to be supporting the opposing side are routinely ill-treated and detained without legal basis, due process guarantees, or judicial oversight. The RSF has engaged in patterns of coercion and extortion, including ransom demands placed on families for the release of detained relatives. These practices have imposed devastating burdens on families already struggling to survive. Particularly alarming are the arrests by RSF intelligence of 70 individuals in El Geneva in May 2026, including humanitarian workers. Their fate and whereabouts remain unknown. Such disappearances undermine humanitarian operations and endanger life-saving assistance. SAF has also arrested civilian leaders, political opponents, lawyers, journalists, human rights defenders, and humanitarian workers suspected of collaborating with the RSF. Many face proceedings marked by serious due process guarantees, and some have been sentenced to death. Detention conditions on the both parties raise grave concern. Thousands of detainees are held in overcrowded facilities with inadequate access to food, water, sanitation, and medical care. Torture and ill treatment, including beatings and electrocution, are frequently used by both parties. Victims reported sexual violence in RSF facilities and sexualized torture of men detained by SAF. Death in custody have also been often reported. Nyala prison in South Darfur, where thousands of detainees are reportedly held by RSF, remains a cause of serious concern. Severe overcrowding, violence, inadequate food and medical care, and denial of family or lawyers' visits appear to be the norm, creating risks of enforced disappearances. Mr. President, we urge all parties to immediately cease arbitrary arrest and detention, release those held without legal basis, ensure humane treatment and due process, disclose the fate, whereabouts, and legal status of all detained persons, and grant independent humanitarian workers and human rights entities unimpeded access to all places of detention. Impunity for international crimes must end. Accountability and concerted international action remain urgently needed to reverse these trends and prevent future atrocities. My colleagues Mona Rishmami and Joy Ngozi Zelo will answer questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed. I now give the floor to Mr. Mohamed Ahmed.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, colleagues, and friends, this is an important dialogue and exchange, and I'm grateful for the work of the UN Fact-Finding Mission and the Office of the High Commissioner for the Human Rights for all they are doing to document, report, and keep this Council informed of the situation in Sudan. We are now in the 4th year of this war. Back in April, the 7th anniversary prompted important gatherings, such as in Berlin Conference. But for Sudanese people, it is yet another anniversary we do not wish to mark. The devastation impact of this conflict on civilians has been all documented. Both SAF and the RSF continue to inflict indescribable suffering on civilians. The use of drones targeting critical civilians' infrastructure has brought further suffering and devastation. Most recently, the use of drones in Al-Ubaid have targeted civilians, including those who are attending funeral. In areas under effective conflict, including Dalanj and parts of Darfur, civilian populations are facing starvation and hunger, and humanitarian tasks with providing life-saving aid are being targeted. The use of drones also disturbing key aid routes. The nature of the rights violations in Sudan range from credibly and well-documented evidence of atrocious crimes, as has been described by the FFM, and the almost total obliteration of space for independent civil society and human rights defenders. In areas controlled by SAF, the authorities dissolved legitimate trade unions like Sudanese Bar Association and the Sudanese Journalist Syndicate, which was awarded the UNESCO World Press Freedom Prize 2026. Lawyers are now only permitted to work if they are registered with the illegitimate bar that was affiliated with the former Islamist regime, despite the Supreme Court recognition of the legitimate bar. Similarly, the authorities do not recognize the elected journalist syndicate. Journalists are now required to register with the authorities' affiliated body that prominent officials from the Bashir regime formerly ran. New amendments of the Cyber Law Act further restrict freedom of speech and diminish space for civil society. Given the scale of conflict-related sexual violence documented in this conflict, no one person has been held to account. Christian Solidarity Worldwide has documented incidents of CRSV perpetrated against civilians, including women, children, and regular use of sexual violence in detention against men. Survivors are left with physical, emotional, and psychological trauma. There is an urgent need to support victims of CRSV, but attacks on humanitarian actors makes that more complicated. Moreover, the legal structure and assumption makes securing legal justice more complicated, and there is a pressing need for additional support for these extremely sensitive and yet devastating cases to be addressed. The contraction of civil society is a stark reminder of repression in Sudan's recent past. There are legitimate concerns that gains made during the transitional period may be erased, despite legal protection in place. There has been consistent documentation of restrictions around Christian places of worship in North, even during the conflict. Vulnerable minorities and religious communities are rightly concerned over their rights to rebuild and restore places of worship that has been severely damaged during this war. Furthermore, there are serious concerns over official interference of the affairs of religious institutions, as was commonplace during Bashir's time. Additionally, those who are responsible for atrocities must be brought to account, not welcomed as heroes. External backers who have been documented and to be supporting parties to the conflict and further the suffering and scale of violations must be brought to account. Repeated and credible allegations concerning states such as the United Arab Emirates warrant thorough investigation. Any individuals or entities found responsible must be held to account for the contribution and for this conflict and complicity in the countless atrocities that the RSF have been committed throughout Sudan. Complementary mechanisms for justice and accountability, as well as protection of civilians, are necessary. The complicities of the conflict in Sudan and the precarious position of the international rules-based order means that we must use all tools within reach for the protection of human rights. This includes the effectiveness of the coalition of the atrocity prevention and the use of the universal jurisdiction by member states. We have seen the effectiveness of this in other conflicts to bring justice and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. In accordance with our practice, we will begin by giving the floor to the delegation of the country concerned. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Sudan. You have 5 minutes, sir.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Chair. May the peace of God be with you. I am the chair of the commission tasked with investigating crimes and violations of our domestic law and of international humanitarian law. I would like to present the fifth report of our commission. The purpose of our participation here is to inform you of measures we have taken to reestablish justice, including for victims, and to combat impunity. Our participation does not undermine our position vis-à-vis the fact-finding mission or the resolution that established said mission. There is a proxy war being waged in Sudan. This is a war for resources, as the High Commissioner said. This war is now in its fourth year following serious violations perpetrated by the terrorist militias against civilians and against our national institutions and facilities. Our commission works fully independently in order to establish justice and to fight against impunity. We work in cooperation with the judiciary, and we have documented crimes and violations which amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity and the crime of genocide. We are speaking of violations of Sudanese law and international humanitarian law. Militias have increased their presence in the various regions, including in Darfur, and these militias have perpetrated violations on the basis of geographic and racial belonging. I'm talking about abuses and displacement and rape, as well as kidnappings and arbitrary detentions. And the worst occurred in the Shala prison and in the Dakis prison. There were several cases that were transferred to courts, and the judiciary is now working on collecting evidence and protecting the witnesses. There are 149,800 odd criminal complaints, including 325 against members of the regular army. 6,158 complaints have been closed, and we have now concluded investigations for 21,787 complaints, and these complaints were referred to the courts. There were judgments that were handed down for some 10,000 cases regarding violations against women and girls. We are speaking about 2,200 cases of rape. Regarding detentions and forced disappearance, you're talking about 14,999 cases. Regarding abuses, we're talking about 39,071 cases and 44,177 displaced persons. As regards damage against infrastructure, you're talking about $761 billion. Sudan is committed to accountability and the fight against impunity. We stand open to engage in any form of professional cooperation in order to establish justice while respecting Sudan's sovereignty and its institutions. An end must be brought to foreign support for militias because they are the cause of the conflict. We would recommend the following: to support the initiative of the Sudanese government to put an end to this war and to end the work of the fact-finding mission, because we have the necessary mechanisms in place in Sudan regarding accountability. The Emirates would need to stop supporting the militia immediately. And finally, we would need to stop transferring mercenaries to Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the presenters and to make comments on their statement. The speaking time is 1 minute and 30 seconds for all. I would like to recall that the duration of interactive dialogue is 1 hour, 30 minutes. If time permits, however, additional delegations will be able to speak. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, the European Union thanks the fact-finding mission for their work indispensable for accountability in achieving sustainable peace. The EU urges all parties to fully cooperate with the fact-finding mission by granting unhindered access. The EU condemns in the strongest terms the atrocities committed by the SAF and the RSF and their allied militias, the deliberate targeting of civilians through siege and drone warfare and deliberate targeting of critical civilian infrastructure are violations of international law and must stop immediately. We are appalled by reports of the recruitment of children as soldiers in El Fasher. The EU will continue to advocate for the expansion of the ICC mandate and the arms embargo to the whole of Sudan. All external actors supplying arms or support of any kind to the parties must immediately cease. Humanitarian access throughout Sudan must be granted and humanitarian workers, supplies, and infrastructure protected. The EU remains committed to supporting the humanitarian response, and together with its member states has pledged over 800 million euro at the Sudan conference in Berlin. The EU will continue pursuing work on the protection of critical infrastructure and will continue to work as part of the quintet with the African Union, the UN, IGAD, and the League of Arab States. We call on all parties to resume the negotiations towards an immediate ceasefire. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iceland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, the Nordic Baltic countries thank the panelists for their updates and commends the FFM for its work. The situation in Sudan remains catastrophic. Credible reports show that both SAF and RSF have committed war crimes, and in February the FFM concluded that the RSF has been responsible for acts that may amount to crimes against humanity. The mission's findings continue to point to large-scale atrocities. We are particularly troubled by reports of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, ethnic targeting, and starvation as a method of warfare. These demonstrate a systematic pattern of abuse that must end immediately. Recent drone attacks and attacks against civilian infrastructure have further escalated the situations for civilians. The risk of further mass atrocities remains high. We call on all parties to immediately cease hostilities, protect civilians, and ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access. Accountability is essential. Those responsible for violations must be held to account. The Nordic Baltic countries will continue to support the FFM and broader efforts to ensure justice for victims and survivors. Finally, we noted with interest the FFM's recent joint declaration with the African Union's FFM on the situation in Sudan. Can you tell us more about this cooperation and what prospects you see going forward? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand on behalf of a group of countries.
I am pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Mr. President, we are deeply alarmed by continued reports of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and a persistent disregard for international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Sudan. As the Deputy High Commissioner has noted, intensified drone warfare striking civilian infrastructure is now the leading cause of civilian deaths in Sudan. Millions of women and girls face widespread and systematic sexual and gender-based violence. Over 11 million people have been displaced, with more than 11,000 missing. We condemn these and all other human rights violations in the strongest terms. We reiterate our calls for all parties to ensure the protection of humanitarian personnel and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance throughout Sudan. We commend the tireless work of humanitarian groups working under extremely challenging circumstances to assist those in need. We strongly urge all parties to the conflict and those with influence to intensify diplomatic efforts towards a ceasefire and a lasting peace. We call on them to comply with international humanitarian law and international human rights law and to ensure that accountability is integrated into peace processes. Mr. President, what more can be done to support dialogue and peace in Sudan?
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya on behalf of the Group of African States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The African Group reiterates its unwavering solidarity with the people of Sudan at this difficult time. We are of the view that the immediate and utmost priority is to silence the guns and achieve the ceasefire, paving the way for humanitarian relief and peace negotiation and political dialogue. We strongly condemn any external interference in Sudan, which is fueling the Sudanese conflict in flagrant violation of all relevant African Union PSC communiques and UNHRC resolutions. The group emphasizes its continued commitment to respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, and political unity of Sudan. We recall the importance of the principles complementarity and the African solutions for the African problems. The group welcomes the regional mediation efforts and the initiative to solve the crisis in Sudan. We also welcome all supporting efforts to the negotiation by regional and international actors. We reaffirm the need for a single coordinated international effort to resolve the crisis in Sudan under the auspices of the AU together with IGAD, with the support of the UN, League of Arab States, and the key international players, and based on the AU roadmap for the resolution of the Sudan crisis. In this regard, the group refers to the welcome of the AU and the IGAD to the peace initiative presented by the government of the Sudan at the United Nations Security Council on December 22nd, 2025. We urge parties to implement Jeddah Agreement to ensure protection of civilian and humanitarian aid delivery in Sudan. We urge the international community to provide all necessary support to Sudan. The group appreciates the cooperation of the government of Sudan with the UNHRC and the UN designated expert and urge it to continue that cooperation. We urge UNHRC to continue its technical assistance to Sudan.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I deliver this statement on behalf of the Coalition for Atrocity Prevention and Justice for Sudan. Thank the UN Fact-Finding Mission for its update and express our grave concern at the human rights crisis across the country. We condemn the use of drones by the Sudanese Armed Forces, the Rapid Support Forces, and their allies. Strikes on schools, markets, and hospitals have left civilians with nowhere safe to go. At the same time, attacks on aid workers, continued siege tactics, restrictions on humanitarian access, and the use of starvation as a method of warfare are accelerating famine conditions and human suffering. Accountability remains essential. To breaking this cycle of impunity, we recommend the work of the UN Fact-Finding Mission in documenting violations and abuses and underscore contributions of Sudanese human rights defenders and justice actors who operate at great personal risk. They must be protected and supported to document and preserve evidence to hold those responsible to account. Mr. President, we call on all parties to end this conflict. External actors must refrain from providing financial or military support. Those with influence must act to advance dialogue and bring parties to the negotiating table for sustainable peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. President. We reaffirm our full solidarity with the brotherly Sudanese people in order to restore peace and security in the Sudan. We have been following with great concern the deteriorating humanitarian situation as well as the wide-ranging grave violations by RSF. We condemn in the strongest terms the systematic atrocities and violations against civilians in Darfur and Kordofan, particularly the attacks against the humanitarian convoys and medical facilities. We reaffirm our rejection to all forms of foreign interventions in the Sudan in order to realize its territorial integrity and sovereignty, being the main pillar of stability. Efforts must be intensified for humanitarian truce as a prelude for a sustainable ceasefire. A comprehensive political track must also be supported that is state Sudanese owned and run. We reaffirm that the national mechanisms for inquiry and accountability must also be supported. No mandates by the Human Rights Council must be extended without the consent of the country concerned, so that the Council can continue to provide technical assistance according to the necessities and needs of the countries concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. The UK thanks the fact-finding mission for this harrowing update. Deplorable that as the conflict enters its fourth year, such grave violations and abuses of human rights continue unabated. Mr. President, we are deeply alarmed by what we have heard today. Systematic arbitrary detention and torture devastate civilian lives. Rape and other forms of sexual violence are abhorrent and must end. Survivors must be supported and those responsible held to account. Let us be clear. Sexual violence must never be used as a tactic of war. Expanding use of drones is intensifying humanitarian need, with over 880 civilians reported killed by drone strikes this year alone. We deplore the continued targeting of civilian infrastructure, including schools, markets, and hospitals. We call on the Sudanese Armed Forces, the Rapid Support Forces, and their allies to comply fully with their obligations under international humanitarian law, enable safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access, and end the fighting. We welcome the continued cooperation between the UN fact-finding mission and the AU finding mission, including the Banjul Declaration. Together, their efforts are critical for ending the cycle of impunity and building the foundations of a peaceful future for the people of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
I thank you, Mr. President. The state of Eritrea aligns itself with the call for peace in Sudan, a sisterly nation with whom we share a profound historical destiny. However, Eritrea remains deeply skeptical of the proliferation of external initiatives that characterize the current international approach to the crisis. The conflict in Sudan is a grave internal matter that requires an indigenous solution, owned and led by the Sudanese people themselves. True engagement by this Council must be anchored in the foundational principles of objectivity, impartiality, and non-selectivity, ensuring that the human rights mechanisms are never weaponized. The history of the Council's interventions in our demonstrates that external investigations often disregard these vital principles, serving as a pretext for political pressure rather than a genuine pathway to stability. We share Sudan's principled rejection of the fact-finding mission's mandate. The Council's mechanisms must not equate Sudan's national army, which is fulfilling its constitutional duty to protect the state, with a rebel militia committing well-documented atrocities. True support means backing Sudan's national institutions, funding the massive humanitarian response shortfall, and supporting the comprehensive peace initiative announced by Prime Minister Professor Kamil Al-Taib Idris. Peace cannot be imported through divisive resolutions. It must be Sudan-led. To conclude, Eritrea stands united with the people of Sudan in these trying times. We urge this Council to support Sudan's national mechanisms in their pursuit for justice, redress for victims, prevent impunity, and deter further external interference. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Señor Presidente.
President, Peru wishes to thank the mission for their update, and we reiterate our deep concern at the worsening humanitarian and human rights situation over the past 3 years of conflict, which has in fact caused one of the greatest displacement crises globally. We are seeing grave violations of international standards. We firmly condemn all of these acts, including summary executions, sexual violence, recruitment of children, arbitrary detention, forced displacement, indiscriminate use of explosives in populated areas, and attacks against hospitals, markets, and schools, amongst others. We've seen the devastating impact of the use of drones, which have been responsible for 3/4 of civilian deaths in the first 3 months of this year. There must be rapid, independent, impartial, effective investigations to guarantee justice, truth, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence. And finally, we call for an immediate ceasefire and to ensure that parties to the conflict comply with their obligations, particularly protecting civilians and infrastructure, ensuring safe passage to people wishing to leave areas of conflict, and ensuring access to humanitarian aid for the population. There must be inclusive dialogue with regional and international support, leading to a peaceful, sustainable, and lasting solution to the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Mali wishes to thank the National Independent Fact-Finding Mission for Sudan. We note once again that the increasingly complex human rights situation in Sudan is connected largely to multiple forms of external interference from different players. We have seen this interference in ongoing attacks against vital infrastructure and civilian services. And we see the use of long-range drones, which is something that is held by states and has fallen into the hands of warmongers other than the Sudanese government. We've seen an initiative from the Sudanese government presented to the Security Council. It covers policy, security, and social areas, and it tries to respond to social needs for development, provide reparation, and start a national dialogue. Would it not be appropriate, President, for the fact-finding mission to consider the problem of the manifold external interference and such acts in order to find those responsible and hold them accountable? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of South Sudan.
Mr. President, South Sudan aligns itself with the African Group statement and take notes of the oral updates of the fact-finding mission and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. As a neighboring country who continues to feel the direct impact of the crisis in Sudan and bound by geography, history, culture, and shared destiny, South Sudan is of the opinion that silencing the gun should be the utmost priority to pave the way to humanitarian relief, followed by political dialogue to reach consensual and sustainable solution within the principle of complementarity and without any external interference. South Sudan remains committed to working with regional and international partners to support all mediations efforts and initiatives aimed at ending the conflict and restoring peace and security in Sudan. We reiterate our unwavering support for Sudan's sovereignty, unity, territorial integrity, and urge the regional and international community to provide all necessary support to Sudan at this exceptional difficult time. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, thank you. President, Ireland aligns with the statements of the EU and of the Coalition for Atrocity Prevention and Justice in Sudan. Ireland remains gravely concerned by the ongoing serious human rights violations and abuses being perpetrated in Sudan. The conflict continues to have a devastating impact on civilians, particularly on women and girls, victims of widespread conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the indiscriminate targeting of civilians, humanitarian workers, and civilian infrastructure by all parties to the conflict. These egregious actions violate international law and must end immediately. President, accountability and justice for the atrocities committed across the country must follow. In particular, we note the FFM finding of a coordinated campaign of destruction carried out by the RSF against non-Arab communities in Al-Fashir, which bore the hallmarks of genocide. It is imperative that perpetrators of these gross violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law are held accountable and brought to justice. Ireland once again calls on all parties to the conflict to facilitate safe and unhindered access to all regions of Sudan for the FFM in order for it to carry out its vital work. Members of the mission, what further practical or high-level support can we, the international community, provide in support of your work? Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, the UAE's position since the outbreak of the Sudanese civil war in 2023 has been unequivocal. There is no military solution to this conflict. Prior to the war, Sudan was on a promising transitional trajectory. This progress was obstructed by a power struggle between two generals, which drove the country into a devastating civil war. In this context, the UAE maintains that the only viable path is an inclusive, independent, civilian-led transition that reflects the aspirations of the Sudanese people. Neither warring party should play a role in shaping Sudan's future. We strongly condemn all violations of international law across Sudan by the warring parties, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, including widespread and systematic acts of sexual and gender-based violence and the use of starvation as a weapon of war. The UAE also welcomes the joint statement on Sudan and the Quintet's efforts, which reaffirms the shared commitment to supporting a peaceful, democratic, and stable path forward. We also welcome the outcome of the Berlin Conference and reaffirm our full support for a humanitarian truce and a permanent ceasefire. Mr. President, before I conclude, we also reject all the false allegations and the targeted disinformation campaigns made against the UAE in this room. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. President. The delegation of the Republic of Iraq expresses its grave concern regarding the ongoing suffering of the brotherly Sudanese people, and we renew our full solidarity with the Sudanese people in this ordeal, given the continued acts of violence and violations against civilians, particularly among women, children, older persons, and the most vulnerable, and the resulting serious repercussions on infrastructure, humanitarian conditions, and general stability in the country. Mr. President, Iraq calls upon all Sudanese parties to prioritize dialogue and reject violence in order to end the conflict and to achieve civilian peace. We reaffirm the importance of joint regional and international efforts to reach a sustainable ceasefire and to engage in a comprehensive peace process that safeguards Sudan's unity and independence and fulfills the aspirations of its brotherly people. In conclusion, Iraq reaffirms the importance of guaranteeing safe access to humanitarian assistance and workers, and to supporting all the efforts to restore security and stability in Sudan in such a way as to reflect positively on security and stability in the entire region. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of UNICEF.
Thank you, Mr. President. The situation for children in Sudan remains devastating. Children face escalating violence, deepening insecurity, and widespread violations of their rights. Attacks in populated areas, including shelling and the use of drones, continue to place children and the civilian infrastructure they rely on at grave risk. Since January 2026, more than 300 children have been reportedly killed or maimed in such attacks. Children across Darfur, Kordofan, Blue Nile, and other areas are being killed and maimed in their homes, in markets, while fleeing violence, and even while seeking medical care, while other grave violations continue unabated, including recruitment and use, abduction, and sexual violence. Beyond conflict-related violations, the war is driving a broader protection crisis for children. Female genital mutilation, child marriage, and the worst form of child labor are placing children, especially girls, at great risk. These harmful coping mechanisms threaten to undo years of progress for children across Sudan. UNICEF calls on all parties to immediately end violations against children, comply with international law, safeguard the civilian infrastructure upon which children depend, and to facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access. Children in Sudan need protection, accountability, and an end to violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indonesia takes note of the update on the situation in Sudan. We remain gravely concerned by continued reports of violation and atrocities against civilians by the rapid support forces in and around El Fasser and Kordofan. These acts are unacceptable and must cease immediately. We note that political process held in Addis Ababa earlier this month, and Indonesia continues to underscore that any political process must be Sudanese-led and owned, fully respecting Sudan's sovereignty and territorial integrity. A process that fails to reflect ground realities or lacks the genuine trust and participation of Sudanese stakeholders cannot deliver lasting peace. Indonesia also appreciates Sudan's constructive engagement with international mechanisms. At the same time, we reaffirm our principled position that the proliferation of mechanisms, especially without the consent and cooperation of the country concerned, risks politicization, undermines effectiveness, and diverts the Council's limited resources from practical impact. The Council must prioritize an approach that supports Sudan as a sovereign duty bearer to strengthen its national mechanisms in addressing human rights violation. And finally, as protection of civilians is paramount, Indonesia calls for immediate and unhindered humanitarian access to all affected areas. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the statements by the European Union and the Coalition for Atrocity Prevention. We thank the fact-finding mission for its continued crucial work for the people in Sudan. Germany expresses its deep concern regarding the continued violence by SAF, RSF and their allied militias and the resulting devastating humanitarian situation in the country. We call on all parties to cease all forms of sexual and gender-based violence, which has become a defining feature of the conflict. The recruitment of children by armed groups depriving an entire generation of their future must stop. The use of drone strikes and other indiscriminate attacks exacerbate the suffering of civilians and hinder any efforts to achieve a lasting peace. Germany is deeply worried about the increasing fragmentation of Sudan. We call on all parties to prioritize territorial integrity of the country. Germany, together with partners, is actively supporting the peaceful solution to this war. The Berlin Conference on Sudan in April 2026 has raised almost 1.5 billion euros in support for the people of Sudan. With the Berlin Principles and the joint call of civilian actors, an important step for a civilian-led transition in Sudan has been made. We urge all involved parties to cease financial and logistical assistance to the warring parties. We further call on all parties to ensure full humanitarian access and to protect civilians in line with their international obligations. All relevant stakeholders should fully cooperate with the FFM and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Appreciated members of the FFM, how can the international community see to it that your findings and warnings are more immediately translated into action? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We've listened to the oral update by the fact-finding mission on the brotherly country of Sudan. The civilian suffering and continued displacement and ever-increasing humanitarian needs remain the most prominent challenge that requires the attention of the international community. In this context, my delegation reaffirms that the top priority must be the protection of civilians and ending the bloodshed and ensuring unhindered humanitarian access to those who need that access. Mr. President, respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sudan is the essential basis for any effort to resolve the crisis. Reaching a comprehensive political solution in Sudan that safeguards the state institutions and fulfills the aspirations of the brotherly people of Sudan remains the most conducive path to overcome this difficult period. My delegation is still supportive of every regional and international effort to de-escalate and to create the conditions for dialogue in such a way as to help restore security and stability in Sudan. In conclusion, we look forward to brotherly Sudan overcoming this hardship so that its people can enjoy peace and security and to return to the path of stability and development, paving the way for a new phase of reassurance and prosperity. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statements of the EU and the Coalition of Atrocity Prevention. Humanitarian needs in Sudan continue to rise at an alarming rate. Millions of people are facing acute food insecurity, displacement, and the collapse of basic services. The anticipated droughts from the next El Niño sketch a bleak picture, compounded by systemic human rights abuses and a climate of impunity. The Netherlands is appalled by the extent and severity of human rights violations in Sudan, as documented by the fact-finding mission. Civilians are subjected to relentless violence, and sexual and gender-based violence is rampant. The fighting must stop. But the protection of civilians must be ensured at all times. Humanitarian workers must be granted safe and unhindered access, and international humanitarian law must be fully respected by all parties to the conflict. Deliberate attacks on civilian targets are unacceptable and must be thoroughly investigated. In this light, we commend the important work of the fact-finding mission, because holding perpetrators accountable lays the foundation for justice and sustainable peace. Members of the fact-finding mission, in accordance with the question posed by the EU, how can we further support your work, in particular to ensure that the experiences of women and girls are fully reflected in your findings? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
Mr. President, since the conflict erupted in Sudan, the Kingdom has honored its responsibility towards our brothers in the Sudan, leading diplomatic efforts to solve the Sudanese crisis, leading to the signing of Jeddah Declaration by both warring parties on May 2023 to protect civilians in the Sudan, to ensure unhindered access, humanitarian access, and respect of the international law. Our priority is to realize stability in the Sudan, to reach a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, and to preserve the state institutions, as well as ensuring territorial integrity of the Sudan. Addressing the crisis in the Sudan requires a state-run, a Sudanese-run political process. The Kingdom continues to provide humanitarian assistance to our brotherly Sudanese people. The King Salman Center provided assistance at the value of $100 million, in addition to a community-based campaign that garnered $133 million, totaling $3 billion of assistance in all vital sectors. My country will exert all efforts to end the humanitarian crisis in the Sudan. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Greece aligns with the EU statement and thanks the fact-finding mission for its update. The conflict in Sudan has resulted in the world's most severe humanitarian crisis, massive violations of human rights, including the recruitment and exploitation of children, arbitrary arrest and detention, sexual violence, as well as the documented pattern of enforced disappearances and missing persons. It calls for decisive international attention and action. We strongly condemn the continued attacks against civilians, including humanitarian and healthcare workers, as well as civilian infrastructure, which in the case of Al Fasher could be characterized as genocide. We call on all parties to immediately cease hostilities, ensure the protection of civilians, and guarantee full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, including through effective humanitarian corridors. We repeat, the international community must act decisively to end this crisis and ensure accountability for those responsible for serious violations and atrocity crimes. We call on all external actors to seize any support that fuels the conflict. Full cooperation is essential to bring perpetrators to justice, alongside sustained international engagement to prevent further regional destabilization. I thank you.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
Thank you, Mr. President. we associate ourselves to the statements made by the groups to which we belong. We stand in full solidarity with the Sudan. We reaffirm that Sudan's territorial integrity and sovereignty must be respected, and humanitarian access must also be ensured to alleviate the suffering of civilians. We call upon all our brothers in the Sudan to continue cooperating with each other to realize a sustainable peace process. We reaffirm our support to the international and regional efforts to end this crisis. We call upon our brothers in the Sudan to resort to dialogue and a comprehensive peace process to end this crisis. In conclusion, the Council must take into consideration the consent of the country concerned when establishing a new mechanism or expanding existing mechanisms. We call upon the OHCHR to provide all forms of technical support to the Sudan to continue its endeavor towards the promotion and protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, the Federal Republic of Somalia remains deeply concerned by the grave humanitarian and security situation in Sudan and strongly condemns all violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law committed against civilians. We recognize the efforts undertaken by Sudanese national institutions in the areas of justice, accountability, and the protection of human rights. In this regard, we emphasize the importance of the principle of complementarity and encourage continued support for nationally led initiatives aimed at promoting accountability, reconciliation, and sustainable peace. Somalia reiterates its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Republic of Sudan. We reaffirm that all efforts aimed at addressing the challenges facing Sudan must fully respect the principles of the United Nations Charter, including non-interference in the internal affairs of states and respect of national ownership. We call upon the international community to support Sudan's efforts to restore peace, stability, and security, preserve state institutions, and address the humanitarian needs of affected populations. Lasting peace can only be achieved through an inclusive Sudanese-led and Sudanese-owned process that safeguards the unity and territorial integrity of Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Mr. President, members of the fact-finding mission, Romania aligns itself with your statement. We thank the fact-finding mission for the updates on this valuable work. We continue to plead for the importance of ensuring adequate resources for the implementation of its investigative mandate and a full cooperation with it, including by granting the FFM unhindered access in Sudan. The conflict is now in its fourth year. The country is on the verge of collapse, and despite their severity, documented also by the FFM, the violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law seem not yet prone to gather the needed international community's commitment for decisive action to prevent further atrocities. We add our voice in condemning the rising use of drones in Sudan and their devastating impact on civilians' life and human rights, including on their access to food, clean water, healthcare, and humanitarian assistance, as the population is facing high risk of food insecurity and displacement. Romania reiterates the calls for urgent action to cease the hostilities, protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, prevent further atrocities, provide humanitarian aid, ensure respect for arms embargo, and advance efforts to ensure accountability, an inclusive and transparent civilian land transition process, and a lasting peace. Members of the Commission, what would you recommend as the most relevant action to be pursued further by the International Atrocity Prevention Coalition? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, Croatia aligns itself with the EU statement. We would like to thank the fact-finding mission for their update, as well as for their valuable work. Croatia remains gravely concerned about the ongoing conflict and serious violations of the IHL and international human rights law committed by the Rapid Support Forces in and around El Fasher, and whose scale, systematic nature, and cumulative effects may indicate a path to genocide. We are appalled by the mission's findings of large-scale killings, mass-scale rape, gang rape, and other forms of torture and cruel treatment, including deliberate starvation. We strongly condemn the increasing use of drone attacks on civilian and civilian infrastructure by both Sudanese armed forces and the RSF. We underline that deliberate targeting of civilians, hospitals, schools, or humanitarian facilities represent violations of the IHL and can constitute a war crime. Accountability for international crimes and breaches of international human rights law and the IHL is fundamental for building a just and sustainable peace. We call on all parties to immediately cease attacks against civilians and ensure rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access to all affected populations, as well as refrain from attacks on humanitarian personnel. We would like to ask the members of the FFM, are there any prospects of negotiations and a broad and inclusive civilian-owned political process in Sudan? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the fact-finding mission for their oral updates and their work. Japan remains deeply concerned by the catastrophic human rights and humanitarian situation in Sudan, where an estimated 30 million people, representing more than half of Sudan's population, require urgent assistance. We are particularly alarmed by the reports of large numbers of casualties, widespread famine and severe malnutrition, gender-based violence, and other grave human rights violations that have already occurred this year. Japan reiterates its call on all parties to the conflict to enact an immediate ceasefire and to respect human rights, in hopes that meaningful progress will be achieved in the transition to civilian rule. Japan emphasizes the importance of drawing the international community's attention to the unprecedented humanitarian and human rights crisis in Sudan, and of further expanding collective support efforts to mitigate its impact on civilians. Japan remains committed to standing with Sudan and the Sudanese people, and at the same time to continuing to contribute to the aforementioned collective efforts toward improvement of the situation in Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, President. There are three indicators that are dominating the general landscape in the Sudanese crisis, which Algeria thinks are a real wake-up call. First, the Sudanese crisis is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, given the various figures and indicators pertaining to the crisis. Secondly, it has become a hotspot for foreign intervention, which helped fuel the conflict and prolonging such a conflict. Thirdly, and despite all of the UN and African efforts in this regard, the horizon and prospects for the solution that we all want for this crisis is still far away from the capabilities of regional and international actors to achieve. And here, Algeria would like to reiterate its position that supports the unity and integrity of Sudan as a state and as a people, and we reject any form of foreign interference in the internal affairs of Sudan. And our position in Algeria calls for mobilizing efforts in order to ensure the best possible handling of this ever-exacerbating crisis at every level. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci. Thank you, President. France would like to thank the mission for the work it's done since 2024. We reiterate our full support for the Sudanese people, who for more than 3 years have been the victim of the conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. We condemn in the strongest terms serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law committed by the parties to the conflict, in particular the RSF during the siege and taking of El Fasher last October. The atrocities suffered by civilians and by women and children in particular are unspeakable. They may amount to wars against war crimes and crimes against humanity. The mandate and the work of the mission are essential for combating impunity of the perpetrators. Humanitarian staff should under no circumstances be targeted, nor should human rights defenders or people tasked with recording any violations that are committed. France remains mobilized. On the 15th of April, alongside Germany, the African Union and the European Union, the United States and the United Kingdom and others, a pledge of 1.5 billion euros was announced to support civilians in the Sudan and in neighboring countries, out of which 811 million euros were mobilized by the EU and its member states. The parties to the conflict need to create the necessary conditions for a peaceful settlement to the conflict, which is the only way to ensure that we can return to stability in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Montenegro.
Mr. President, we thank the fact-finding mission for the update and commend its continued efforts to document violations and abuses and to amplify the experiences of victims and survivors. By establishing facts and preserving evidence, it contributes to accountability efforts and the protection of civilians. As Sudan enters the fourth year of conflict, civilians continue to bear the devastating consequences of a deepening humanitarian emergency marked by the world's largest displacement, hunger, and the collapse of essential services. The mission's findings document grave violations and international crimes committed by conflict parties and their allied militias in Sudan. This underscores the urgent need for a comprehensive and sustainable ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian access, and action to prevent further atrocities. The Berlin Conference and subsequent consultation with Sudanese stakeholders reaffirmed the importance of Sudanese own political process as the only viable path towards ending the conflict. We support an inclusive, civilian-led transition to achieve a durable peace that reflects the aspiration of the Sudanese people and preserves Sudan's unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Accountability remains indispensable to lasting peace. We therefore call on all parties to cooperate fully with the mission and join calls to extend the ICC mandate and the UN arms embargo to the whole of Sudan. Lastly, we would welcome the mission's reflections on how the international community can further support its efforts and advance accountability in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We regard Sudan's unity, territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence as fundamental pillars of our principled approach towards Sudan and the African continent. The conflict in Sudan is not only threatening the unity and social fabric of the country, but also poses serious risks to regional stability. We believe that the most effective way to end the conflict is through dialogue and diplomacy. In this context, Turkey participated in the Sudan Conference held in Berlin on 15 April 2026 and joined the adoption of the joint communique on afterwards. While these meetings are valuable in keeping Sudan high on the international agenda, their ability to contribute to a lasting solution remains limited in the absence of Sudan's legitimate representatives. Therefore, His Excellency Prime Minister Kamil Idris's announcement of the peace initiative in December 2025 constituted an important step forward. We believe that this initiative deserves the full support of the international community. The humanitarian consequences of the conflict have reached alarming levels, with millions displaced and thousands of civilian casualties. In this regard, Turkey will continue to provide humanitarian assistance to help alleviate the suffering of the Sudanese people. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka is concerned about the recent developments in Sudan and the dire humanitarian impact it has had on the lives of civilians. The human rights of the people of Sudan must be protected. Sri Lanka calls on all concerned parties to respect international law, cease hostilities, and engage in a constructive dialogue and cooperation to support the national efforts of Sudan to achieve peace, stability, and reconciliation. Mr. President, while recognizing the complexity of the situation, we reiterate that imposing country-specific initiatives will neither lead to achieving peace nor stability. Such initiatives, with the support of the country concerned, are both counterproductive and ineffective, leading to the waste of limited resources. Thus, this Council must strictly adhere to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states and abide by the guiding principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity that are stipulated in the General Assembly Resolution 60/251 and the IB package. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liechtenstein thanks the fact-finding mission for its oral update and commends its continued work. Sudan's civilian population continues to bear the brunt of relentless violence. Both the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces continue to commit grave violations of IHL, including unlawful killings, arbitrary detention, torture, and indiscriminate airstrikes on civilian areas. In South Kordofan, the violence has reached a new level of intensity with drone strikes and shelling, killing dozens of civilians, including children and local responders. The RSF's conduct is particularly alarming. Starvation tactics, widespread rape, and sexual violence may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Attacks on medical facilities, food markets, and humanitarian convoys continue to deepen an already catastrophic humanitarian crisis. We strongly condemn these acts. Liechtenstein is also gravely concerned by the deployment of private military contractors supporting the RSF, including in El Fasher. We call on all states to immediately halt the supply of weapons, equipment, and any other military support to the parties implicated in serious violations of international law. Mr. President, we welcome the establishment of the Sudan Atrocity Prevention Coalition and look forward to seeing it translate into concrete action for the people of Sudan. Accountability for the crimes committed against the Sudanese people is long overdue, and impunity must not be allowed to persist. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
L'air de cesse est retiré sur la liste des orateurs. Merci.
We will speak at a later stage. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président,
President, Switzerland would like to thank the fact-finding mission on the Sudan for its update and for its essential work. We'd also like to thank the representative from civil society for his participation in this dialogue today. Switzerland remains deeply concerned by the ongoing deterioration of the situation in the Sudan. We share the concerns voiced by the High Commissioner about the increasing use of armed drones by parties to the conflict. Attacks against civilians who are already suffering a great deal and against civilian infrastructure not only violates international humanitarian law, but also worsens the suffering of the population, while at the same time risking further escalation of the conflict and mass displacement. We call on all states to end all transfers of weapons to the parties to the conflict. Switzerland commends the joint declaration that was adopted with the fact-finding mission and the African Commission on Peoples and Populations' Rights, and we recommend the swift implementation of these recommendations in order to protect civilians and in particular to combat and prevent sexual violence, ensure humanitarian access, protect human rights defenders, and strengthen accountability while preserving evidence. Distinguished members of the mission, in light of your joint declaration, what priority measures should the African Union and the relevant regional actors take in order to support the implementation of your recommendations and strengthen protection of civilians as well as the fight against impunity? I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovenia aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the fact-finding mission for its oral update. As the conflict in Sudan entered its fourth year, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces continue to fight for the territorial control in Sudan with their allied militias amid shifting conflict dynamics. Slovenia strongly condemns the rising use of drones and deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian objects in densely populated areas. Once again, we underscore the fact-finding mission's findings on El Fasher that atrocities of RSF show hallmarks of genocide. We, the international community, need to translate these findings in action, strengthen protection of civilians and accountability efforts. We reiterate the urgent need for an immediate humanitarian truce and a sustained cessation of hostilities.
We call on all parties to the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law and refrain from the use of drones against civilian targets. External actors supporting parties to the conflict should immediately cease all support that enables the continuation of hostilities. Appreciated members of the FFM, you play a critical role in documenting violations and abuses of international humanitarian and human rights law in the context of the ongoing conflict. How can we make sure survivors will get justice and prevent further atrocities to be repeated in Kordofan and elsewhere in Sudan? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, President. Tunisia reiterates its solidarity with the brotherly people of Sudan in this difficult phase, and we reiterate our full solidarity with the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Sudan and all the assaults that it has been subjected to. The way out of the crisis must first and foremost be internal, to end division and achieve national reconciliation towards a political resolution based on equality and the protection of human rights, away from any foreign interference that undermines the independence and sovereignty of the state. Tunisia calls upon the international community to redouble efforts to de-escalate and to ensure unhindered humanitarian access and alleviating the suffering of the Sudanese people, while engaging further towards lasting peace that guarantees prosperity and development for Sudan and its people. In conclusion, we laud the efforts of Sudan in engaging with the human rights mechanisms of the UN and the OHCHR and its positive engagement towards building capacities in human rights based on its needs and national priorities. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, President. My delegation takes note of the oral update by the FFM on the human rights situation in the brotherly nation of Sudan. Kuwait reiterates its strong condemnation to the serious violations by the RSF against the civilians, which led to the exacerbation of the humanitarian crisis and grave suffering in the civilian population across Sudan. We reiterate the importance of protecting civilians and ensuring unhindered humanitarian access in a safe and rapid manner, while adhering to international humanitarian law provisions and ensuring that those responsible for the violations will not benefit from impunity. Kuwait insists on the urgent need for a comprehensive solution by starting with an immediate ceasefire, prioritizing dialogue, and resuming a comprehensive political process led by the Sudanese themselves in such a way as to safeguard the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Sudan, and achieves the aspirations of the Sudanese people to peace and security, and in line with the regional and international efforts in the matter. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
President, South Africa aligns with the African Group. Given the importance of subsidiarity and complementarity, we appreciate the FFM's efforts with the FFM on the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. In this fourth year of Sudan's conflict, which was recently characterized as an atrocities laboratory, a litany of horrors continues to be visited upon the innocent. Beyond the war crimes committed by all parties, the RSF have perpetrated crimes against humanity of widespread rape, sexual violence, persecution, and extermination, together with identity-based targeting that the FFM found bears the hallmarks of genocide. Given the human tragedy in El Fasher, we dare not dismiss the dire warnings about the risk of atrocity crimes in Kordofan and elsewhere. Indeed, there can be no military solution to the conflict. South Africa therefore shares the concerns expressed about the impact of advanced armed drones. We call for a ceasefire, acknowledge the various mediation initiatives, and underscore the need for a coordinated effort under the auspices of the AU and IGAD. Those responsible must be held accountable, including those who aid and abet them. As the High Commissioner stated, behind the destruction in Sudan lies a complex web of strategic and economic interests. Accordingly, foreign interference and efforts to fragment Sudan must stop. The flow of arms must end and the guns must be silenced. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China has listened to the oral briefing from the RFFMM. China is highly concerned about the developments in Sudan, calls for immediate ceasefire and cessation of violence, proper handling of differences among through dialogue and consultation and a prompt restoration of stability. All parties should play a constructive role in this regard and jointly contribute to Sudan's return to lasting peace. We appreciate the efforts by the Sudanese government in promoting and protecting human rights and calls on all parties to respect its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. The Sudanese government repeatedly reiterated its opposition to the establishment of the FFM, and imposing a country-specific mechanism against the will of the government will only further complicate the issue. China supports the UN in strengthening cooperation with the Sudanese government, continuously improving humanitarian access, and resuming international aid to Sudan as soon as possible and avoid escalation of the humanitarian crisis. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished representatives, colleagues. This was the last speaker we could accommodate for this morning. And this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. to continue the enhanced interactive dialogue with the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for the Sudan, and to hold the enhanced interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. I hereby close the first meeting of the 62nd session of the Human Rights Council.
you.